Ready? Live from
Okay, we
Montgomery.
are live.
Good morning and welcome to the House Environment Committee. This morning, we are welcoming Keith Thompson to give us an update on changes we made to the current use program. Welcome, Keith.
Thank you. By way of introduction, my name is Keith Thompson. I'm the Private Lands Program Manager with Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation. Been doing this job for about 10 years. Grew up in Waterbury, studied forestry, and was a private consultant for several years before becoming the Chittenden County Forester back in 2011 and taking over this job around 2015. I've been working in use value appraisal my entire career, so I'm really excited to be able to share on it today, work on it every day. I think it's a really incredible program. So for today's presentation, I'm going to start off with just a little bit of context. I think it's always good to lay the foundation, just thinking about our forests as a whole. Talk a little bit about the use value appraisal program, some of the elements of it, and that relate to the reserve forest land program. And touch on some aspects of that related to old forest stewardship and some of the goals we have in the state for old forests and how reserve forest land supports that. So I'll dig in. So Vermont's forest land covers about 4.5 million acres. The private land is about 3.5 million acres. And it provides a huge number of values for us. It's the foundation for the habitat that we depend on and the ecological functions that we all depend on, and the plants and animals and so on depend on. And that requires an intact, connected, and diverse landscape. And the same image is right up here. This is Vermont Conservation Design, use value appraisal, and the private forest lands throughout the state are among the primary contributors to the values that this land provides. Forest economy is a big part of that. In supporting that, it's complementary to it, not just compatible with it. The values that forests provide economically have a huge benefit for the landowners that own them, and they support a lot of other outcomes related to wildlife habitat and other things. We all know that carbon is a huge value, especially right now with climate change. In 2022, the forest sector compensated for 67% of Vermont's statewide greenhouse gas emissions. So that's through the sequestration that forests did relative to the emissions of the state. This is preliminary data from Ali Kasiba's 2025 Vermont Forest Carbon Inventory. This will be published in the very near future. We all know and love wildlife. Vermont's forests are the foundation of the wildlife habitat and the biodiversity in the state. It supports a breadth of wildlife that are dependent on a huge diversity of conditions, different species composition, different soil types, different forest structure, young forest, old forest, and everything in between. And of course, with the past couple of summers, we've had the water values that forests provide in terms of flood attenuation, clean water, and aquatic habitat. There is not a better land cover to support the waters that we depend on from the state, and forests help contribute to that. Maintenance of those forests while providing all these other values is the best we can hope for. So ownership of Vermont's forest land, 80% of Vermont's forest land is owned by private landowners. And so when we think about the values that we depend on from forest land, it's from private landowners to a large degree. That's not to diminish the importance of national forests or state lands. They're incredibly important and they provide different important values. But private lands are foundational to a lot of those values that you just need the scale of private lands to provide and realize all those benefits.
Can we just talk briefly about other private? I'm thinking about, I don't know, Millward
Yes.
College, so other larger private, but not individuals. Is that what that is?
Okay, so the other private, that's what you're referring to. Yes, so that would be conservation organizations, Middlebury College, businesses, Weyerhaeuser, for example. So the spectrum of organizations that are not just generally families. And when we think about private stewardship, it's really important to zoom in. We often see the forest in these maps, which blend everything together, and it's so important to look at things at that scale. Nothing happens unless it's connected and intact and diverse. And yet, this stuff is happening on a parcel by parcel basis, individual by individual basis. And those individuals that own that land have very unique circumstances, values that they care about, connections to that land, beliefs about that land, different motivations for owning it, different financial circumstances, opportunities and struggles that they're navigating. And so when we think about how we steward our forest land, many Vermont landowners are not connected to their land, and yet they value it deeply, or they're not connected to it in certain ways. And how we ensure that the values that I listed at the beginning, that are really important public values, can be the best aligned with their personal values as the owner of that land, and support them to take actions and steward that land in ways that both provide those values I listed above or earlier on, and achieve their personal values, and that they feel equipped and motivated to do so. That motivation, that appreciation of is, I think, given the increasing cost of owning land, that's in non-financial value that helps balance their calculus to make it worth owning land. And so that's something that we do in Forest Parks and Recreation, is help connect people to their land, understand their values, and find opportunities to steward it that achieve their goals while advancing a lot of the public values that we depend on from forests. And so UVA, use value appraisal, also known as current use, does a lot of this all at the same time. And so there are kind of two statutory purposes framed up for current use. One, more succinct, in preserving the working landscape, the rural character of Vermont, and protecting the ecological systems and natural resources of the forest land in Vermont. But beyond that, there's a much more complete and thorough articulation of the purposes. And some of these are really aligned with each other and directly related, and others are a little bit more distant from each other. Encouraging and insisting in the conservation and preservation of future productive use. That's one. And for the protection of natural ecological systems. That's another. And those can be aligned. They can be pursued together, but you could maximize one outcome over the other without achieving both. And then the purposes go on, and there are more: equitable property taxation, for undeveloped lands, encouraging and assisting preservation and enhancement of Vermont's scenic natural resources, assisting in climate adaptation and mitigation. And again, there's a long list of very worthwhile purposes, but maximizing one over another could create an imbalance. And so every change that we consider, and reserve forest land was a good example of this process, is how to advance one valuable, important goal while maintaining and balance with other important goals. And we can get into that in a little bit. I'll step away from the purposes and dig into what's enrolled in the program, what's eligible. So back in 2022, as part of the reserve forest land development, we did an analysis about the amount of enrolled land in the program, how many parcels, and which parcels would be eligible likely. And so this is all a modeling exercise based on parcel data and some calculations about which parcels have a certain amount of forest land and might otherwise be eligible. So what we found was that about 55% of eligible forest land parcels are enrolled. And so that's 16,000 of 29,000 potentially eligible parcels. There's about 70% of eligible forest acres are enrolled. So that's about 2 million of potentially 2.77 million acres that would be eligible. I think an important distinction for these numbers is that there's unlikely to be more eligible acres. That will likely go down as parcels get smaller. There will likely be more eligible parcels over time as parcels are subdivided. As long as they maintain the minimum eligible acreage, they will continue to be eligible.
And can you just go through those minimums, just to make sure everyone knows them?
Sure, we'll touch on that a little bit more, so I'll reinforce it in a little bit, but it's basically for forest land, it's a 25-acre parcel with a minimum of 20 acres of forest land managed for saw timber. That's with the exception of land enrolled for reserve forest land, and I'll touch on those eligibility requirements as well. So when a parcel is enrolled in use value appraisal, it is taxed at its use value as opposed to its fair market value. So prior to enrollment, land is taxed at its fair market value, and its fair market value might be $2,000 an acre. And that's what the property would be taxed at. Once it's enrolled, it gets taxed at its use value. So in 2024, the use value is $188 per acre for forest land. Agricultural land has a separate use value. It's $483 per acre in 2024. For lands that are greater than a mile from class 1, 2, or 3 roads, forest land is that use value is basically 75% of the base use value of $188 per acre. In terms of savings, 100-acre property that is valued at $1,500 an acre will save $2,624 a year when it's enrolled in the program. That gets a bit more complicated when there's 2 acres that are excluded for a house or things like that. But it's a pretty significant savings. This savings will go up if the fair market value of the land is greater. It'll go down if the fair market value of the land is lower. Right now, naturally, they're tending to go up. As long as the property remains enrolled in the program, they'll receive this tax benefit. Historically, there used to be 9 use values, I believe, which was extremely complicated for calculating and mapping, just which acres applied to which use value, so on. So there have been discussions in the past about trying to best align an appropriate use value with the land condition and its potential for generating income. That was the first iteration of use value that wanted to be as precise as possible with the land enrolled, but found that it was very burdensome to administer. And so you can imagine that the different economic generation potential of a forest that is, say, plantation white pine, large, big, straight trees, very efficient to harvest, nice and flat. The economic potential of that might be much greater than forest land that has very shallow soils, is growing mostly beech sprouts or something like that. That doesn't have a lot of economic potential, and yet they do receive the same use value. To do otherwise would be a very difficult task. And we'll get into that a little bit as it relates to reserve forest land. In terms of enrollment, there are 2 main enrollment categories in use value appraisal: managed forest land and agricultural land. Under managed forest land, there are several other sub-enrollment categories: productive forest land, reserve forest land, conservation land, site for lands, open lands, ecologically significant treatment areas, and some others. The vast majority of land enrolled in forest land use value appraisal is under this productive forest land header. About 92% of all forest land enrolled in that are subject to management plans are enrolled in this category. Behind that, Site 4 lands or wetlands has 3%, conservation land has about 2%, open lands also has 2%, and reserve forest land, the most recent enrollment category is 0.3%. I'll talk more as we get on in the presentation about enrollments in acres in that category and what we believe is happening there. In terms of forest land eligibility, so at least 25 acres of enrolled land with a minimum of 20 acres of productive managed forest land are necessary for eligibility in the program, unless it's reserve forest land. Property that is enrolled in the forest land category, the management needs to be approved by Forest Parks and Recreation. It needs to be consistent with a forest management plan and map, meeting minimum management standards. The minimum management standards are established by the Commissioner of Forest Parks and Recreation. Lands that are eligible as ecologically significant treatment areas or reserve forest land do not require timber to be the primary management objective. So these are lands that have ecologically significant features or have become eligible for reserve forest land and therefore can be managed for other values that are specific to those enrollment subcategories. Examples for ecologically significant treatment areas would be forested wetlands or riparian areas along streams, habitats for rare, threatened, and endangered species, rare natural communities, could be managed for the ecological values of those specific conditions, as opposed to saw timber. If the conditions are present, the landowner chooses to do so, they are not obligated to enroll in those categories if those conditions are present. All Site 4 lands, which are predominantly wetlands, are eligible when all the other prerequisite conditions are met. In terms of program delivery, our staff, we've got 13 county foresters and several administrative assistants who are helping to process this. We review about 2,000 forest management plans per year. We inspect about between 650 and 1,000 properties each year. We handle about 1,500 property transfers every year, and we do a lot of landowner education, trying to help people and communities appreciate their forests, see the potentials for stewardship for all sorts of values. So we do about 300 presentations annually to about 3,000 participants. This landowner education aspect is incredibly important right now, particularly in light of the rate of property transfers. You can imagine it takes a long time as a landowner to get familiar and comfortable and inspired to steward your forest land. There's a lot of risk. There are a lot of costs. As a new landowner coming in, many are starting from scratch, and they aren't benefiting from the years of conversations that they've had with consulting foresters, county foresters, ecologists, wildlife biologists, or others to understand what's going on in their forest, how it could support their objectives, or not. And so we're at a place, particularly with some loss of forest land, with climate change, with expanding development, trying to help people make wise decisions and informed decisions about their forest land. So that's a really big initiative for us. Would it be okay if people have questions about use value appraisal? Because I'm going to move into the reserve forest land and old forest part.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, Representative Austin.
Yeah, I'm just wondering with that wetlands, when you probably couldn't build on them anyway, why would they be in the reserve?
Eligible for use value appraisal. It's a big part is because they are part of our forest land.
Mhm.
They do get taxed at fair market value, which is not its use value. And so there is a cost of owning wetlands. And so there are many different kinds of conditions that may not be developed but do have a burden of ownership, cost burden of ownership that are embedded in our productive and forest land. And so I think that's the rationale. It started long before I was in this position.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
So interestingly, perhaps the fair market value of a wetland might be lower than the use value assessed, that, but it's, yeah, it's an interesting question. Representative North.
Yes, Representative Rob North from the Virgins area in Madison County. Thank you for the presentation. Question, just do you know kind of roughly what the net reduction in collected and paid property tax is based on all of the current use land? In other words, how much money is the state not collecting, and i.e. therefore how much money are landowners saving?
Yeah, so Jill Remick would be the best person to speak to this with property valuation review. The net is about $76 million per year. And some portion of that, and property valuation review has an annual report, and these, what they articulate as landowner savings is in there. And it was submitted recently. I believe it's 55 million in the education tax, and the remainder is in hold harmless payments from the state to towns. As you raise that question, it is a worthwhile discussion that many folks will articulate the financial impacts of the program in different ways. Some folks will articulate it as a savings for landowners. Others will articulate it as a cost, and others more will articulate it as fair taxation. And I think it's probably true that all of those are fair ways to describe this depending on the context. Particularly as somebody moves from an unenrolled condition to an enrolled condition or back out. There is the point at which this was developed back in the 1980s, there was a stronger shift to ad valorem taxation away from a use value approach, and a more unified, consistent approach statewide. And farmers in particular were getting taxed out of their land. And so this was in many respects a way to correct that and say, if people are managing their land for forests or farms, maybe we shouldn't be taxing them as if it's a house. In which case, is it truly a cost or a savings, or is it just a choice? And therefore just equitable taxation. So that's that side of that perspective.
Thank you. Representative Tagliabue.
Question about you talking about cost and requirements or hurdles to enroll and then to unenroll. Do you have an average cost either per acre or per parcel to unenroll?
It is currently 10% of the fair market value of the land being withdrawn from enrollment. That is a hard number to define because it becomes easy to calculate on the 100 acres that are enrolled and the whole property is being removed. It's 10% of that fair market value. But if you're removing 2 acres, the fair market value of those 2 acres, that might be a house lot. And that 2 acres is not a prorated valuation of the total 100 acres. It is a new acreage that needs to be assessed by the town prior to determining the land use change tax. And that's something that the tax department has come to the legislature in the past to try to fix. It's difficult to estimate the cost of withdrawal when you're enrolled and removing something less than a whole enrolled parcel.
So just for clarification, how many times when someone was to go and try to unenroll land, would the land be defined as a house lot or a building lot?
I
Is
need
that
to,
the inclination, first inclination, well, this is a building lot and the inclination is to tax it or the cost would be at a higher rate?
it's a great question. For better or worse, this isn't our area of administration of the program. Would be with property valuation and the towns who do these assessments and what their responsibilities are when assessing the value of a property. So they've got some protocols and approach that's pretty consistent for making that determination. I consider myself grateful to not be navigating that part of it.
That's good.
Representative Sakowitz.
Yeah, just a comment in terms of how much money, like, we might be missing out in some sense in taxes by having this land enrolled in the use value program, that if this land was all taxed at fair market value, my understanding is that we would very likely see very different tax rates. And so I don't think I think the question gets a lot more complicated in terms of, it's not just like, oh, if we just taxed it all at fair market value, this is what we would generate. We would likely see a much lower number than that is my guess, although I can't prove that because it's a policy choice that the legislature obviously would have to make if we were to go down that road. But I think it does turn out to be a somewhat subtle and complicated answer when we start looking at what the real effects would be.
And I'll add one more layer if I may. If the land wasn't enrolled and therefore the affordability of owning and stewarding forest land or farms was not what it is as a result of use value appraisal, what costs would we incur related to all those values? Loss of industry, loss of water quality, carbon sequestration, wildlife habitat, goes on. New York City has chosen to acquire and support a lot of forest land so that it doesn't need to manage water infrastructure. It is more affordable to maintain and steward forest land than it is to have clean water plants. And we don't have a city like New York City that we're stewarding, but we all depend on our forest land in a lot of different ways. And so I think that the calculus gets further complicated and probably hard to kind of really come to any final number on those things. But we know every time we walk to our car or drive home and look around that there's a ton of value that we're gaining from this land.
Thanks for that additional perspective.
Yeah, and we're typically not, we haven't proven well in calculating those benefits of things. We focus on costs, but we're not that great at the other side. We're getting better. And I think we'll hear more about that. A couple of kind of more nuts and boltsy questions from me, which are on your slide 15, the conservation land category.
Yes.
Can you just flesh that out for us a little bit?
Yes. That enrollment category was created a few years after this program started. It's eligible exclusively to nonprofits in the business of conserving land. So Nature Conservancy, Vermont Land Trust, these organizations that own land in fee, not that they have easements on, but they own land in fee, can enroll land for their conservation values. They do not need to be managed for saw timber. They do have forest management plans. They do steward those for conservation values. There are a little bit more than 50,000 acres enrolled in the program.
Thank you. And then what is the kind of cost? And I'm going to say of the over here, just the majority of the individual family and parcels enrolled. What's the typical cost for a management plan? 100 acres of forest land.
I'll speak personally. When I was consulting 100-acre management plan, what was I charging? And it's gone up a fair bit. I think $1,500. It could range quite a bit. Would be a starting point. To prepare a management plan requires evaluation on the ground. It requires, and that can, depending on what's being managed for, could be a pretty intensive evaluation of the forest land. They're measuring regeneration. They're measuring diameters of trees and density of trees. They're evaluating road systems, and then they're coming back and crunching those data, mapping them, and then preparing a plan with prescribed activities.
And it's my recollection this current use program started mid to late 80s, is that right?
I believe it passed in 1977. I think the first years of enrollment were in 1980.
Oh, okay. 1980. I know Middlebury had their own kind of current use program that we kind of folded into this, but it was in the late 80s that we folded it in, so.
Many
thanks.
towns had their own programs. Jericho had one until very recently, even.
Representative Tagliavia.
Just a point to what you said about the forestry plan. Your number is very accurate.
I was actually a little nervous.
Oh, yeah, okay, that's good. Thank you. And that's every 10 years, someone needs to do that.
Every 10 years, yeah.
And at the 10-year mark, you can also you're just out. If you don't re-enroll, you're out of the program, no penalty.
You'll be removed from the program. So when a property is enrolled in the program, a contingent lien is placed on the property, which requires that land to be managed according to the management plan or the minimum management standards. If the property is removed from active enrollment, it will cease to receive benefits, but the lien persists on the property. They remain obligated to manage that land to minimum management standards. It is not reviewed or evaluated in the same way. There aren't the same authorities to do so. But the lien persists so that if at some point in the future that land is developed, then the land use change tax will be owed.
Representative Tagliavia.
When the land transfers with that lien, what happens?
The lien remains.
Representative Bartholomew.
Do management plans for forest land always include harvest?
Land that is enrolled in the productive forest land category needs to be actively managed for saw timber. So how they are being managed for saw timber can vary. It may be appropriate, depending on the condition of the forest, to not do any harvesting for 40 years. If the land was cleared or is regenerating from agricultural land, or there was some young forest management, it may be that forest is too young to actively harvest. And the appropriate thing to do for saw timber would be to take no action for perhaps several management cycles. So, but that's not to say that land isn't being managed for saw timber just because it's not being actively harvested.
So you put your land into the program, you're gonna save in tax, have to pay for a management fee. Right?
You have to pay for the plan.
Yeah, you have to pay for the plan, but theoretically, at some point, you're gonna generate some revenue from harvesting. Right? Do I have that?
At some point, yes, and it may be in your ownership or the future ownership. Yeah.
We probably need to move on in the interest of time.
Okay.
Sure.
Old Forest. So Old Forest has gotten a lot of discussion. I know that it's been discussed a fair bit in this committee. Old Forest characteristics are really valuable for native biodiversity, wildlife habitat, hydrologic regulation, carbon storage, forest resilience. And these values don't just come with age, they come with the characteristics that are associated with an old forest, like large old trees, spatial variability in tree density, abundant down dead wood, multiple canopy layers, large standing dead trees, regeneration, and unique plant communities. So these are characteristics that after hundreds of years of trees growing up, trees dying, you get these characteristics that provide all these functions and then these values. These functions and values are not exclusive to Old Forest. They are part of maturing forests. They can be actively managed for and developed, but Old forests do provide these values. In some cases, they're enhanced by old forests, and thus old forests are valuable. It doesn't diminish the value of the other forest conditions. other forest conditions and stewardship approaches provide other and unique values in addition to these. Vermont conservation design is clear. Old forest is functionally absent as a component of the landscape. And Vermont conservation design sets out a target for old forest. I was a co-author of that chapter. 9% or 419,000 acres of forest land should be in an old forest condition to support the values across the landscape that old forests provide. Currently, it's estimated that about 218,000 acres of forest land are in a conservation condition that will allow them to develop into old forest over time. That's not to say that they're in an old forest condition right now. They're not providing those values today, but they will develop over time. And so when thinking about that as a target, those old forest conditions, and I want to make the distinction between the old forest conditions and conservation that supports and protects forests to allow the development of old forest conditions. But Vermont conservation design is looking at old forests as one target, and it's really important to consider that target in the context of other targets and goals. Young forest is a Vermont conservation design target. It is not one that we have enough of, according to Vermont conservation design. Particularly in some parts of the state, we have virtually 0% of our target of young forest. Young forest will not develop in the scale or condition without active management to support many species of greatest conservation needs. Vermont Fish and Wildlife would be best to speak on that. And that's, again, not to say it's not a value judgment of one or over the other. When we're looking for biodiversity, different species require different conditions, and we need to support all of it. We need old forest, we need young forest, and we need this stuff in between that can go both ways and is managed for a diversity of other values, including forest economic goals, recreation, supporting old forest characteristics, even if it's not moving all the way to old forest condition. And so I just want to, whenever we're pursuing these targets, trying to keep in mind that we're pursuing all of them together if we're really achieving the goals of Vermont conservation design.
Balanced inquiry with getting through the presentation. So I'm going to ask Keith to keep going.
Recent analysis that Bob Zano did, we're asking, well, how much of VCD is supported by UVA, and 32% of highest priority forest blocks are not permanently conserved, but are enrolled in use value appraisal. 11% of Vermont conservation design is permanently conserved and in UVA. So a total of the 43% of land is enrolled in UVA, some of which is permanently conserved. 43% of Vermont conservation design highest priority forest blocks are enrolled in UVA.
Third or in neither.
Correct. So reserve forest land, with all that context of why old forests, how it relates to some of these other important values. Use value appraisal, you remember one of the primary purposes is maintaining the productive use of forest land. So when we were developing reserve forest land, maintaining UVA's program focus on forest stewardship that produces forest products was one of the primary focuses. And yet we recognize that any landscape has embedded within it all sorts of other functions. Not every acre needs to produce saw timber. And therefore, having a category that provides these additional and complementary values in a way that doesn't supersede or eclipse these working lands purposes is something that as a whole makes the program workable and stronger. And so the secondary objective was the old forest objective, to increase opportunities to achieve old forest on UVA enrolled lands at a scale and pattern that will help Vermont benefit from old forest values. So this went into effect in July of 2023. In order to ensure at that time that the land's purposes would be sustained, the strategy was that those lands that have some limitations for active stewardship or have ecological values that warrant management for values other than saw timber should be those that are eligible. And so there were some eligibility criteria established at the time that the legislature adopted. And so baseline eligibility is consistent with the broad requirements of the program. 25 total enrolled forest land acres, 20 acres are forested productive soils. And there are two thresholds: parcels with greater than 100 enrolled acres. This is forest land and ag land combined. 30% or more of the parcels enrolled acres need to be composed of significant and sensitive conditions. We've got a certain suite of standards describing that. And parcels with less than 100 acres, enrolled acres, 50% or more of the parcels enrolled acres would need to be composed of those significant and sensitive conditions. And those significant and sensitive conditions are described or bulleted here on the bottom. They include all the significant, ecologically significant treatment areas. So again, those are riparian areas, old forests, rare natural communities, forested wetlands, and there are a few more. It also includes steep slopes, greater than 35%. Those can be difficult to manage responsibly. It includes site forelands. Again, those are wetlands, and special places and sensitive sites. So think cultural heritage sites, things like that. So if a property in aggregate is 50% or more of those conditions when the parcel's less than 100 acres, then the entirety of the forest land on that property can be managed for old forest and enrolled in reserve forest land. A property that's enrolled in this program or in this enrollment subcategory, the management plans have old forest specific evaluation description requirements. You'll remember at the beginning, the values of old forest are related to characteristics associated with the old forest. We don't get the values of old forest unless we're getting those characteristics. And so we need to be evaluating those and supporting management for those, whether it be active or passive. The management of the property, again, must be managed for old forest values and functions. We have been very clear with folks, this is not a do nothing category. And by do nothing, I mean, it's not a whatever the condition is, I'm leaving it alone. It might be kind of like the example of the timber management. We are on track to support this outcome for old forest, and therefore no activity is the appropriate activity. But that's different than having a white pine plantation that is all one species, has no structural diversity, and is a long ways away from old forest characteristics. In that case, they would be required to actively manage. It's a rare circumstance. It doesn't happen much, but they would be required to do so. Invasive plants need to be stewarded in a way that populations are reduced over time. They do not need to be eliminated. In many cases, that's not realistic, and there can be prioritization for that, but we can't be losing our ability to progress towards those old forest conditions. And acceptable management practices. You need to deal with water quality. There are some properties that may enroll in this program, enroll in reserve forest land, that they still need to tend to water quality on their lands, and that may require investment. Enrollment in this category is voluntary. It may be some or all of a parcel. And landowners may transition between eligible categories. So a land that's currently enrolled in productive forest land can choose to enroll in reserve forest land. If in the future they choose to enroll in productive forest land, both enrollment conditions have value to the state. They will be allowed to change enrollment categories. In terms of current enrollments, we've estimated the eligibility for properties in the program. We estimate about, of the enrolled land, about 532,000 acres of currently enrolled forest land would be eligible. That's about 27% of the currently enrolled acres by parcel would be eligible for this. About 15% of parcels would be eligible for this. And so many of the smaller parcels, because they have that higher threshold of 50%, not 30%, those are not eligible. Or there are fewer smaller parcels. That's why there's the discrepancy. And you can see of the potentially eligible but not enrolled parcels, about 21% of acres of not enrolled parcels might be eligible for this, and 13% of parcels. We have to date about 31 parcels that have enrolled in this category, 5,473 acres of forest land. In some respects, this is a success. In some respects, it's not successful yet. When I presented this last year, at this time, there were 19 parcels that had enrolled as of April. Some of the reasons for current enrollment numbers, I think the primary reason is limited landowner awareness. They don't know that this is an option. They don't know that their property might be eligible for this. Plans are due every 10 years. If somebody puts out $1,500 for a management plan 7 years ago, they may be eligible for this category, but the likelihood that they're going to put up another $1,500 for a management plan 3 years before their is due is pretty slim. Many of them, given the infrequency of harvesting activity, they don't need to enroll in this program 3 years early to receive the benefits. So they'll wait. So that's one option. We've only had one full plan cycle. We're coming up on the second on April 1st for enrollment. It's a reality that for some who are very interested in actively managing for saw timber, who want to maintain a clean forest, or have other values, that this is not the enrollment category for them. And they may choose something else. As I mentioned before, big factor is going to be eligibility limitations. Many properties are not going to be eligible for this enrollment category, and that was by design. So those are some of the reasons. So like I said, most will not be eligible. Only about 15% of parcels are expected to be eligible. When we hear from a landowner who's really interested in old forest, but not eligible for this category, our message is that old forest characteristics can be achieved decades sooner with thoughtfully designed active management strategies. They can both advance old forest and they can be enrolled in the category and receive benefits. And when they get that forest to an old forest condition, like truly old forest condition, it could be eligible as an ESTA and eligible as reserve forest land in the future. People can manage towards that condition. It will take decades. It's not something that happens overnight or with one management activity, but it is possible. So landowners are encouraged to talk to their foresters and consider their options with that. Related to the passive pathway to old forest or active pathway to old forest, this is something that we really try to help landowners recognize who are truly focused on the values of old forest. That if we value old forest for the biodiversity it provides, the ecological functions it provides, if we have a disturbance in a current old forest that reduces habitat for all the things that depend on it, they need a place to go. And if we haven't done our work to support the forest characteristics that provide all those values and those habitats, they don't have a place to go. So there is some real value. This isn't to diminish the role of passive management, but real value in active management. The values that these provide don't happen overnight. Even if you have a large tree, that's really important in the seed it produces and the cavities it produces for habitat and the opportunities for lichen or so on. Once that tree falls, it may be decades or more before you get the beetle, the fungi, that even find it or populate it to the degree that really provide the old forest values and functions. And so that's just to point out many of the passive management strategies that are extremely valuable. They're really valuable for the way that they protect forests, but they aren't providing those functions today. If beech leaf disease wipes out beech and there isn't nesting opportunity for black-throated blue warbler, and we haven't done the active management to establish regeneration that creates nesting opportunities and places for the insects to forage in that 5 to 15 feet height in a forest, those black-throated blue warblers don't have a place to go as they lose that other habitat. And so we can support development of that habitat that produces those old forest values and functions. It produces a lot of those economic values related to the forest economy, supports jobs and so on. And it can really be a win-win-win while keeping landowners enrolled in the program and advancing and aligning their objectives towards old forest values and functions. So our next steps with reserve forest land are really to support landowner awareness of the enrollment opportunity, support forester proficiency in eligibility and plan development. I think that them selling the plans to landowners and making landowners aware that their property is eligible. I know how to do this. I can do this at a reasonable cost. These new plan standards, they're new. And doing something new when you're selling a product costs more. And so there's some learning curve. We've got some money that we hope we can hold on to with Inflation Reduction Act that can invest in supporting landowners to develop plans that would meet some of these standards and support resilient forests and may bend that learning curve a little bit. Finally, we've got a report that's going to be due next year. This was part of the act that established reserve forest land. We've got to draft and submit a report on reserve forest land on January 15th, 2026. And this will discuss current enrollment rates, its impact on working lands, its progress towards old forest goals, and a few other elements. So I'll conclude there.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your testimony. It's always, as you can see, an area of interest for the committee. I'm going to indulge myself first and say, I just asked, what have you done? What did you do to make landowners and foresters aware of the program so far? And then you say, support them. How will you support them further?
We've got a reserve forest land website on our Forest Parks and Recreation page. We've got links to landowner tutorials about eligibility, why old forest is valuable, how to enroll. We trained consulting foresters on this. County foresters have done several presentations. I couldn't quantify them, but this is whenever we're discussing what people's opportunities are in the program, this is something that always comes up.
Great. And you said you have a grant now to kind of ramp that up, that you hope you.
It's not exclusive to reserve forest land, but it's supportive of working on forest land to support resilience. This is totally in line with that.
Great, thank you so much. Two, I saw a quick one. Representative Pritchard and Austin.
So I have two questions. I guess the first is old forest growth characteristics versus old forest. How much difference is there between the benefits of the two? Does old forest characteristics, what benefits do they not offer that an old forest does offer?
Yeah, so.
And where I'm going with this, I mean, if we're thinking of expanding our old forest back, percentage.
Sure.
This seems like, rather than waiting 300 years, this seems like a quicker way to achieve that.
There are trade-offs with whatever strategy you use. If we're actively developing old forest, it has a cost. If we're bringing equipment in, there may be costs associated with maintaining the roads. There may be some soil disturbance. There may be costs associated with developing that structural diversity. We may need, and often will, pull trees out that help pay for that cost. And that's its own value and it's its own cost. one of the values associated with old forests is the carbon it stores. If we're pulling trees out, then we're creating that structure, we're creating opportunities for regeneration, we're growing larger trees faster. Those are all on the plus side of old forest. But if we're pulling those trees out, that tree is no longer available to store carbon in that form. It may as a forest product. There can be issues with pulling out low quality trees and removing certain habitat opportunities. And so I really strongly advocate for a yes and yes approach, that we don't pursue one over the other. We pursue both.
But can we achieve balance through one?
Can we achieve balance?
Closer to the goals, and I guess my next question is, do you have the overall picture, 100% of what your plan is? I don't know if you have a goal of that. What is the breakdown of new forest, old forest, managed forest? I mean, is there a target number that you think is ideal for the state?
Well, VCD describes 9% old forest, 3 to 5% for young forest. It's broken out by region. Managed forest is a little bit more nuanced. In some respects, all of it is managed, even if it's passive, it's kind of a management strategy. We know that there are places that are embedded within all of that are being handled in different ways.
And where do we sit there?
Where do
right
we
now?
sit in terms of young forest? It varies by state. The Northeast Kingdom is, I believe, around 3 to 4% young forest. It's lower on the old forest targets. Northern Greens are closer in terms of the protection status towards old forest. Its actual conditions throughout the state, very limited. I think in terms of conditions, we're lacking on both young forest and old forest, and advancing towards those in the near term is going to require a real concerted effort, active concerted effort.
So I'm sorry to do this, but your folks are going to have to get their questions answered offline, and we have to respect the next witness who is actually with us already, but we're going to take 5 minutes. And thank you so much, Keith Thompson. You're great educator of this for us. We really appreciate it.
For having me. No, Ally, you know.
Yeah, but we have a good lineup this morning.
Good.
Just convert on that study.
Yeah, probably.
And that's some power slide.
That is the question. I think
He was like,
exactly what the answer. And Dillner with Forest Parks and Recreation would be really best suited. Dan Dillner.
Okay.
And he runs
To visit
fire
friends.
programs for Parks and Recreation. I think it's fair to say we're on increasing risk. And the challenge is that there are so many unknowns. Fires